Come closer. Let me tell you about the ghosts of Saipan. Not the spirits of the dead, though God knows there are enough of them haunting that small, volcanic rock in the Pacific. No, I'm talking about a different kind of ghost. A ghost on the radio. A voice that whispered lies into the ear of an empire and, in doing so, helped break its back. Our story, our investigation, doesn't start in a smoke-filled room in Pearl Harbor or with a general staring at a map the size of a wall. It starts in the dirt. It starts in the suffocating, wet-wool heat of a Japanese command bunker, dug deep into the coral limestone of Saipan in late June 1944. Imagine it. The air is thick with the smell of damp earth, sweat, and the faint, metallic tang of fear. The only light comes from a single, naked bulb, powered by a sputtering generator, casting long, dancing shadows that make men look like wraiths. And in this tomb-like space sits a young signals intelligence officer, Lieutenant Kenji Kinoshita of the Imperial Japanese Army. Kinoshida's world is not one of rifles and bayonets, but of static and whispers. He is a hunter of phantom signals, his headphones a permanent extension of his ears. For days, his world has been a symphony of chaos. The constant, earth-shaking thunder of American naval guns, the drone of their endless air patrols, and the crackle of panicked reports from the front lines. The Americans, the giants, are on his island. The plan, the grand, perfect plan, the Ago operation was for Admiral Ozawa's combined fleet to sweep in, catch the American Navy at its most vulnerable during the invasion, and deliver a decisive, war-ending blow. The soldiers on Saipan were simply the bait. Their job was to hold, to bleed, to die, until the fleet arrived. But the fleet is late. The whispers from Tokyo are confused, and the Americans are not behaving as the plan predicted. Kinoshita is listening. He's hunting for the voice of the American command, trying to divine their intent from the ether. His fingers, delicate as a watchmaker's, dance across the dials of his Type 94 radio set. He's filtering out the noise, the battle chatter of individual Marine fire teams, the pilots calling out targets. He's searching for the big fish, the command net. He's looking for the voice of the American admiral in charge of this whole brutal affair. And then he finds it. It's a crisp, clear signal, using a high-level American naval cipher he's only ever seen in textbooks. It's methodical, professional. The cadence is pure Annapolis. The call sign is one he recognizes: a major command vessel, a battleship, or a heavy cruiser, the nerve center for a portion of the vast American fleet anchored just offshore. The voice is calm, authoritative, issuing orders for naval gunfire support, coordinating logistics between ships. This is it, a gold mine of intelligence. But then something is wrong. Kinoshita's partner, a grizzled sergeant, is working the triangulation gear. It's a simple piece of equipment. You get a bearing from one listening post, another bearing from a second, and where the lines cross, that's your target. The sergeant checks his math, wipes the sweat from his brow with the back of a dirty hand, and checks it again. He looks at Kinoshita, his face a mask of complete, utter confusion. The signal isn't coming from the sea. It can't be. Kinoshita rips the headphones from his ears, the silence of the bunker now more deafening than the static. He looks at the map. The sergeant's trembling finger stabs at a grid coordinate. It's a point deep inland, miles from the coast. It's a dense, jungle-choked valley at the foot of Mount Tapachau. A place of tangled vines and jagged volcanic rock. A place where no ship could ever be. Yet from that impossible location, a United States Navy captain was, at that very moment, commanding a fleet of warships. It was a violation of the laws of physics, a lie on the map, a ghost in the machine. And as Lieutenant Kinoshita stared at that map, a single, terrifying question began to form in his mind. A question that would soon consume the entire Japanese high command on Saipan. How had the Americans managed to drag a battleship to the top of a mountain? Lieutenant Kinoshita, his report trembling in his hand, stood before his commanding officer, Colonel Jinsaku Igawa. The bunker, which served as the regimental headquarters, was no larger than the one Kinoshita had just left, but it felt entirely different. Here, the air wasn't filled with the electric hum of radio gear, but with the heavy, oppressive silence of command. Maps, stained with sweat and marked with grease pencil, were pinned to the damp earthen walls. Colonel Igawa was a man carved from granite and duty, a veteran of the endless, grinding campaigns in China. He saw the world not as a place of mysteries, but as a series of tactical problems to be solved with the rigid geometry of military doctrine. He did not believe in ghosts. He listened to Kinoshida's frantic report with a stony patience that was more unnerving than any outburst of anger. He took the triangulation data, glanced at it, and placed it on his makeshift desk with the quiet finality of a man closing a book he'd found uninteresting. An atmospheric reflection, Lieutenant, the colonel said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. The signal is bouncing off the volcanic rock of Tapachau. It's a known phenomenon. Your equipment is sensitive. The constant American shelling has likely knocked it out of calibration. He waved a dismissive hand. Get your sergeant to recalibrate your instruments. We have real threats to concern ourselves with, not radio specters. This was the official explanation. It was clean. It was logical. It fit perfectly into the known universe of warfare. A ghost on the radio was simply a machine that had lost its mind. Colonel Igawa took Kinoshida's terrifying, physics-defying discovery and filed it neatly away in a mental cabinet labeled Battlefield Anomalies, a place for phantom lights, nervous sentries, and other wartime fictions a professional soldier had no time for. For the high command, the case was closed. The plan remained the plan hold until the fleet arrives. The anomaly was just noise. Kinoshita felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He knew what he had heard. The clarity of the signal, the strength, the lack of any distortion. It wasn't an echo. But to argue would be insubordination. He bowed, defeated, and turned to leave, the colonel's tidy explanation ringing hollow in his ears. But as he reached the burlap flap that served as a door, an orderly rushed in, nearly colliding with him. The man was a runner from the forward aid station, his face pale, and his uniform smeared with mud and blood. He carried a message for the colonel. It was a preliminary report from the sole survivor of a 5-man reconnaissance patrol. The patrol, from the 43rd Division, hadn't been looking for radio signals. Their mission was simple: scout a specific jungle valley, the same valley from Kinoshita's triangulation for potential sites for a new ammunition cache, hidden from the prying eyes of American aircraft. They were not expected to encounter the enemy. That sector was considered secure, a tangled mess of jungle that the Americans, with their love of roads and open ground, would surely bypass. The report was a fragment, a feverish nightmare whispered by a dying man. He spoke of being hunted by demons who moved without sound, of seeing his comrades vanish into the deep green twilight of the jungle canopy. But amidst the terror and the pain, he reported something concrete, something real. He spoke of finding strange, black vines, thick as a man's arm, snaking through the undergrowth. They were not natural. They were rubberized, heavy, and humming with a faint, deep power. The patrol had tried to follow them to their source, deeper into the valley. That was when the demons had struck. Colonel Igawa read the report, his expression unchanged. To him, it was just another tragic, but expected, combat loss. An American patrol had laid an ambush. Unfortunate, but simple. He was about to set it aside when Kinoshita, his voice barely a whisper, spoke from the doorway. "Sir, permission to see that report?" The colonel, annoyed at the interruption, handed it over. Kinoshita's eyes scanned the page, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw the grid coordinates of the ambush site. He pulled out his own map, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold it steady. He cross-referenced the coordinates. They were a perfect match. The patrol had been ambushed at the precise origin point of the Phantom Navy command signal. The black vines the dying soldier had spoken of weren't vines at all. They were heavy-duty American power cables. The colonel's neat, tidy explanation: the atmospheric disturbance, the faulty equipment shattered. An echo doesn't need power cables. A ghost doesn't leave tracks. This wasn't a glitch in the machine or a trick of the light. It was real. Something was in that valley. Something large, something sophisticated, and something that drank enough power to require lines as thick as a man's arm. The Phantom captain had a lair. And as Colonel Igawa looked from the scout's dying words to the young radio officer's terrified face, he realized the comfortable reality of his battle map had just been ripped to shreds. The question was no longer if something was out there. The question was, what in the name of the Emperor were the Americans powering with those cables? The revelation in Colonel Igawa's bunker changed the very chemistry of the battle for Saipan. The phantom radio signal, once a dismissible curiosity, was now a dagger of pure, cold dread pointed at the heart of the Japanese defense. This wasn't just a tactical problem anymore, it was a strategic nightmare of the highest order. To understand the depth of their terror, you have to understand the fundamental law of island warfare, a law as immutable as gravity. The beaches are everything. Think of an island fortress like Saipan as a medieval castle. The sea is the moat. The beaches are the only gates. Every defender, from the lowest private to General Saito himself, commander of all Japanese forces, lives and dies by a single, sacred assumption: the enemy must come from the sea. Your heavy guns point at the sea. Your machine gun nests are sighted on the beach approaches. Your reserves are positioned to counterattack any landing force that dares crawl out of the surf. The entire island is a coiled spring, wound tight to repel an attack from one, and only one, direction. The phantom signal, now confirmed as a physical presence deep inland, took that fundamental law and snapped it over its knee. Imagine you're defending that castle, every archer and pot of boiling oil aimed at the main gate, only to hear the clear, crisp blast of an enemy trumpet from the dead center of your own courtyard. It means the enemy isn't at the gate. He's already inside, and you have absolutely no idea how he got there. This is what Colonel Ogawa was now facing. A high-level American naval command post, operating from a landlocked jungle valley, meant one of several catastrophic possibilities. First, and most terrifyingly, was the idea that the Americans had achieved a secret, second landing. That under the cover of darkness, or through some unguarded cove, they had managed to slip a significant force past the coastal defenses, a force capable of hauling and protecting a sophisticated command and control center. This would mean the entire Japanese defensive line was not a line at all, but a brittle shell that had already been cracked open from within. Or, perhaps worse, it suggested a new kind of warfare. Some new technology. Could they have landed this equipment in pieces by glider? Dropped it by parachute? Was this a new doctrine, a spearhead of command and control designed to paralyze them before the main assault even began? The questions were multiplying, each one more terrifying than the last. Because a command post doesn't exist in a vacuum. It requires protection. It implies the existence of a hardened, elite unit of American soldiers operating deep within Japanese lines, a ghost army guarding a phantom captain. The strategic danger was immense. From that central position, the phantom command post could see everything. It could direct naval gunfire with pinpoint accuracy, not just on the front lines, but on reserve areas, ammunition dumps, command bunkers, the entire nervous system of the defense. It could coordinate air attacks and direct troop movements, seeing the Japanese positions from behind, exploiting weaknesses no one on the beaches could possibly see. They were no longer fighting an enemy they could see coming. They were fighting an enemy who was already sitting behind them at the dinner table, holding a knife. Colonel Ogawa, a man of action, felt the cold grip of paralysis. Every instinct screamed at him to send a full battalion into that valley to hunt down and destroy this threat. But that was exactly what he could not do. His troops were already stretched to the breaking point, locked in a brutal, meat-grinding fight on the coast. Pulling a battalion out of the line to chase a ghost in the jungle would create a gap, a weakness the main American force would exploit in a heartbeat. He would be damned if he did, and damned if he didn't. The clock was ticking. Every moment that signal remained on the air, the Japanese defense of Saipan bled a little faster, guided by an invisible hand. The phantom captain had not fired a single shot, yet he had already achieved a stunning tactical victory. He had sown chaos, paranoia, and doubt. He had forced the Japanese high command to question the very ground beneath their feet. There was only one option. A full-scale assault was impossible, but a scalpel could be used where a sword could not. Colonel Ogawa picked up a field telephone, his knuckles white. He was calling for the specialists, the men who knew the jungle, the hunters. The order was given: a hand-picked platoon of the best jungle fighters on the island was to be assembled immediately. Their mission was not to report, not to scout. It was a mission of search and destroy. Find the source of that signal, kill everyone there, and bring back proof of what this phantom command post truly was, before it bled them all dry. The hunt was on. Sergeant Major Ishii was a creature of the jungle, a man whose skin had been turned to leather by the tropical sun and whose eyes missed nothing. He had learned his craft not in a sterile training camp, but in the green hell of New Guinea, where the jungle itself was as much an enemy as the Australians. He and his 30 men were the best the 43rd Division had to offer, a ghost platoon, masters of silent movement and the sudden, brutal application of force. Their mission, whispered to Ishii by Colonel Igawa himself, felt like something from a fever dream: find an American battleship's command center that was hiding in a jungle. They moved at dusk, melting into the tangled labyrinth of vines and volcanic rock that clawed its way up the slopes of Mount Tapachau. There were no maps for this kind of terrain, only a compass bearing and the instinct Ishii had honed over years of fighting. They moved with the patience of predators, a dozen meters at a time, followed by long minutes of absolute stillness, listening. Listening for the snap of a twig, a cough, the metallic click of a rifle bolt, the tiny, careless sounds of an enemy who felt safe in what he believed was his own territory. For 2 days, they found nothing but ghosts. The jungle was unervingly quiet, and they found traces of the American patrol that had been annihilated: a discarded ration tin, a single blood-soaked piece of webbing, but no sign of the strange, heavy cables. Doubt began to creep into the platoon. The men whispered. Was the dying soldier delusional? Was this a wild goose chase, a fool's errand ordered by a panicked command? Ishii silenced them with a glare. He trusted the fear he had seen in Colonel Igawa's eyes. Fear like that wasn't born from rumors. The breakthrough came on the 3rd day, just after the oppressive heat of noon. One of Ishii's point men, a wiry corporal named Tanaka, froze. He didn't shout. He didn't even turn. He simply raised a clenched fist, the signal for contact. Ishii slithered forward on his belly, his rifle cradled in his arms, every nerve ending alive. He followed Tanaka's gaze. At first, he saw nothing but a wall of green. Then, his eyes adjusted. He saw the lie. It was a patch of vines, crawling up the trunk of a massive banyan tree. But they were the wrong shade of green. A little too uniform, a little too perfect. And they hung with a weight that was unnatural, lacking the gentle, chaotic sway of real foliage. Ishii felt a surge of adrenaline, the cold, thrilling certainty of a hunter who has finally found the trail. He gestured silently to his men, and they fanned out, becoming part of the landscape. Slowly, methodically, they followed the camouflaged vine. It wasn't a vine at all. It was a cable. Thick, black, and heavy, just as the dying soldier had described, but cleverly disguised with netting and painted foliage. It snaked its way deeper into the valley, a telltale artery leading directly to the heart of the mystery. The platoon shadowed it for another hour, moving with agonizing slowness. And then they found the source. It was a clearing, but one that wouldn't have been visible from 100 feet in the air. The Americans had been clever. They hadn't cut down the jungle canopy, they had hollowed it out from below, leaving the massive treetops as a natural roof. Beneath this green ceiling was a small, bustling encampment. Tents, generators humming softly, and a spiderweb of smaller wires running everywhere. At the center of it all, shielded by sandbags and camouflage netting, was a radio shack. A tall antenna, disguised as a dead tree, reached up towards the canopy. And there, sitting on a crate outside the shack, calmly smoking a pipe and reading a paperback, was an American officer. A Navy captain, his eagles gleaming in a stray shaft of sunlight that pierced the leaves. Ishii's breath caught in his throat. It was all real. The radio, the cables, the captain. But it was also wrong. The scale of it. He had expected a fortress, a bastion defended by a company of elite Marines. Instead, he saw maybe 24 men, tops. They weren't digging in or setting up machine gun nests. They looked relaxed, almost casual, like a support unit on rear echelon duty. There were men cleaning rifles, a cook stirring a pot over a field stove. They were technicians, not commandos. The whole encampment felt soft, vulnerable. It was an enigma wrapped in a contradiction. It was a high-threat target with a low-threat presence. A wave of triumphant optimism surged through Sergeant Major Ishii. The colonel was wrong. This wasn't a spearhead. This wasn't a secret army. This was a mistake. A small, vital, and fatally arrogant American unit that had pushed too far, believing itself invisible. He had them. He had 30 of the Emperor's best jungle fighters against 24 soft American technicians. The odds were a gift from the gods of war. The plan formed instantly in his mind. They would wait for the deepest point of night, then strike from all sides at once. A storm of bayonets and grenades. It would be a slaughter, a swift, silent massacre. The Phantom of Saipan was about to be exorcised with Japanese steel. The darkness beneath the jungle canopy was absolute, a thick, black ink that swallowed light and sound. For Sergeant Major Ishii and his men, this was their element. They were the ghosts the Americans whispered stories about, the silent killers who materialized from the jungle's gloom. Each man knew his role. They had spent hours observing the American camp, mapping every tent, every path, every sentry's routine. The technicians were soft. Their discipline was lax. The night belonged to the Emperor. Ishii gave the signal, a soft click of his tongue that was swallowed by the chirping of insects, and the ghost platoon began to move, a closing net of silent death. Corporal Tanaka, the same sharp-eyed scout who had found the trail, was the tip of the spear. He slithered on his belly toward the first sentry, a young American leaning against the fake tree antenna, smoking a cigarette. The glow of the cherry was a beacon in the dark. Tanaka was a dozen feet away 10-5. His hand was already on the hilt of his knife. The attack would begin with a single, soft exhalation of breath as the sentry's life was extinguished. And then, the world broke. It wasn't a gunshot or an explosion. It was a sound. A loud, metallic click that echoed through the clearing, followed by the unmistakable crackle of a loudspeaker. A calm, amplified American voice sliced through the darkness, speaking not in frantic alarm, but with the casual air of a teacher addressing a classroom. Okay, they're in position by the banyan root. Light 'em up. Before Ishii could even process the words, the jungle erupted in a man-made dawn. Trip flares, strung invisibly at ankle height, ignited with a blinding magnesium-white glare, turning the pitch-black jungle into a stark, overexposed photograph. Every shadow vanished. Every Japanese soldier, frozen mid-stride in what he thought was perfect cover, was suddenly naked, exposed, silhouetted against the trees. The jungle, their greatest ally, had become a cage of light. And then the loudspeaker spoke again, this time in perfect, fluent Japanese. A different voice, cold and mocking. Sergeant Major Ishii of the 43rd Division. You and your men are invited to die. Panic, a sensation Ishii had not felt since he was a raw recruit, seized him by the throat. This was impossible. This was a violation of every rule of warfare he had ever known. Before the shock could even register, the second wave of the trap was sprung. Machine guns, pre-sighted on the exact firing positions Ishii had so carefully chosen for his own men, opened up from hidden spider holes he had never seen. They didn't spray and pray, they fired in precise, controlled bursts, scything through the exposed Japanese soldiers. The men he had seen lounging, cleaning rifles, and cooking stew were gone. In their place were killers. They moved with a terrifying economy of motion, not from the tents, but from concealed bunkers and fighting positions around the camp. The camp itself was a prop, a stage. The casual technicians, the smoking captain, the humming generators, it was all a meticulously crafted illusion. A lure. Ishii watched in horror as his elite platoon, the pride of the regiment, was dismembered. They were jungle fighters, masters of the ambush, but they were now caught in a far more sophisticated one. They were blinded by the light, deafened by the loudspeaker that was now broadcasting screaming, distorted recordings of bonsai charges, and pinned by an enemy who knew exactly where they were. The Americans weren't just fighting them, they were deconstructing them, using their own tactics against them with a brutal, technological superiority. The promising lead hadn't just become a dead end. It had become a tomb. Ishii realized with a surge of ice-cold dread that the phantom captain hadn't made a mistake. He hadn't been arrogant. He had been brilliant. He had dangled a piece of bait so tantalizing, so seemingly vulnerable, that he knew Japanese command couldn't resist sending their best to destroy it. And he had built a machine specifically designed to kill them. The mission was never about the radio. The radio was the cheese. He, Sergeant Major Ishii, had been the mouse. And as he saw the dark, efficient shapes of the American commandos moving through the strobing flares, hunting down the last of his terrified men, he finally understood. They were not the hunters at all. They had been the prey from the very beginning. The slaughter in the jungle clearing was absolute. Of the 30 elite soldiers Sergeant Major Ishii had led into that valley, Only he and the wounded Corporal Tanaka managed to escape, crawling on their bellies through mud and volcanic rock, the mocking laughter from the American loudspeaker chasing them all the way back to their own lines. Ishii's report, delivered to a stunned Colonel Agawa, was not a tactical summary. It was the testament of a man who had seen a new kind of god of war, a god of electricity, deception, and merciless psychology. The news ripped through the Japanese command bunker like a shockwave, annihilating what little morale remained. Hope, which had flickered briefly with the dispatch of Ishii's platoon, was extinguished and replaced by a gnawing, infectious paranoia. The Phantom Captain wasn't just a voice anymore. He was a master tactician, a puppeteer pulling strings they hadn't even known existed. The easy explanation that this was a soft target was a catastrophic misjudgment. The enemy was not only inside their fortress, he was a brilliant, cunning sadist who had built a perfect trap and baited it with their own arrogance. The investigation was at its lowest point. The direct approach, the application of pure force, had ended in a bloody fiasco. They had lost some of their best men and gained nothing but a deeper, more profound fear of the enemy's capabilities. How could they fight an enemy who could read their minds? How could they counter a foe who turned their own strengths, their mastery of jungle warfare, into a fatal weakness? Colonel Agawa and the other commanders on Saipan were trapped in a paradox. The threat in the valley was now so demonstrably dangerous that it had to be eliminated, but the attempt to do so had proven so disastrous that no one dared risk a second assault. It was Lieutenant Kinoshita, the young radio officer who had started it all, who provided the next piece of the puzzle. While the command staff wrestled with their impossible tactical problem, Kinoshita had returned to his true element, the world of whispers and static. He was broken by the failure of the mission his discovery had launched, but he was also driven by a technician's obsessive need to understand. He couldn't fight the Phantom Captain with a rifle, but perhaps he could fight him with radio waves. He had a new, desperate idea. He wasn't hunting for the captain's signal anymore. He now knew precisely where it was. Instead, he began hunting for its opposite. He was searching for a void, for a pattern of silence. Here's the thing about a high-powered radio transmitter like the one the Americans were using. It's like a rock thrown into a pond. It doesn't just make one splash, it creates ripples. When it's broadcasting on a certain frequency, its powerful signal bleeds over, creating harmonic interference on other, nearby frequencies. It's a bit like trying to have a quiet conversation next to a roaring jet engine. The sheer power of the engine's noise drowns out everything else. Kinoshita began meticulously scanning the entire radio spectrum around the Phantom Captain's broadcast frequency. He was looking for dead spots, for frequencies that should have had traffic on them, chatter from American planes, ships, or tanks, but were eerily silent. For a full day, he found nothing. And then he got a hit. It was a very narrow band, high up in the VHF spectrum, a frequency typically used for short-range, line-of-sight communication between ground troops and their artillery support. Near the American-held beaches, this frequency was a constant buzz of activity. But in a specific cone-shaped area fanning out from Mount Tapachau towards the Japanese lines, it was dead silent. Utterly, unnaturally quiet. The Phantom Captain's transmitter was so powerful, it was completely washing out this specific channel. This, on its own, was just a technical curiosity. But then Kinoshita had his moment of inspiration, the kind of intellectual leap that changes the course of a battle. He remembered a lecture from his Signals Academy in Tokyo, a discussion about the Americans' greatest industrial and technical strength coordination. Their ability to make the tank, the plane, and the gun work together as one single, brutal machine. Their holy grail was perfectly synchronized artillery. The pieces began to click into place in Kinoshita's mind. The Phantom Captain's powerful broadcast wasn't just for communication. It was a cover, a massive, island-wide jamming operation. He wasn't just talking to his own fleet, he was deliberately deafening the Japanese. Why? Because the Japanese had their own forward artillery spotters. They were hidden in caves and on hilltops, calling in fire from their own big guns onto the American beaches. The Phantom Captain's signal was designed to jam their radios, to sever the link between the eyes on the hills and the guns behind them. But it was a two-sided coin. While jamming Japanese communications, the powerful signal also created a sterile, silent channel for the Americans themselves. A private, interference-free highway through the chaos of the electromagnetic spectrum, a channel that would be perfect for their own forward observers to communicate with their own artillery, without any fear of being overheard or jammed in return. And then the final, terrifying piece of the puzzle fell into place. He recalled intelligence reports, dismissed at the time as Allied propaganda, about a new American technology, a secret weapon called the VT fuse. It wasn't a guidance system that could steer a shell, but something almost as terrifying. It was a tiny radar set packed into the nose of an artillery shell, designed to detonate it at a preset altitude above the ground. An airburst. It would turn a single shell into a storm of downward-raining shrapnel, bypassing the protection of foxholes and trenches. To be effective, this technology required precise coordination and observation. It required an observer to tell the guns not just where to fire, but when to detonate. It required a perfect, crystal-clear communication channel. Kinoshita felt a cold dread wash over him. The camp wasn't a command post. It wasn't a targeting beacon for a magic bullet. It was something far more fundamental and far more lethal. It was an electronic warfare station designed to achieve one goal: to let the Americans talk, while ensuring the Japanese could not. The reason the camp was so small was because it wasn't the main weapon. It was just one small part of a vast, invisible system. The real threat wasn't in the jungle at all. The real threat was 10 miles out to sea, and in the fire direction centers behind the American lines, where hundreds of guns were being coordinated to fire as one. They were about to unleash a perfectly orchestrated storm of steel, and the Phantom Captain's only job was to make sure the Japanese never saw it coming. Lieutenant Kinoshita stumbled back into Colonel Egawa's bunker, his face ashen, clutching his new analysis like a sacred text. He wasn't reporting a tactical position anymore, he was unveiling a conspiracy. The men gathered around the map: Egawa, the regimental staff, and a liaison from General Sato's 31st Army headquarters listened in stunned silence as the young signals officer laid out his terrifying new theory. He spoke not of soldiers and guns, but of harmonic interference, electronic warfare, and the devastating potential of the VT fuse. He was a doctor explaining that the fever their patient was suffering wasn't the disease, but merely a symptom of a far more lethal cancer growing unseen within the body. The Phantom Captain's encampment, the object of their obsession and the graveyard of Ishii's platoon, was a decoy, a brilliantly constructed piece of misdirection. Its true purpose, Kinoshita explained, was twofold. First, its loud, authoritative naval command signal was a psychological operation, designed to make the Japanese believe a major headquarters was operating deep inland. It was a lure, designed to draw their best troops into a prepared killing ground, which it had done with spectacular success. Second, and far more insidiously, the signal's immense power was a form of electronic warfare, a brute force jamming operation blanketing the island, blinding Japanese artillery spotters and cutting them off from their own guns. The true purpose of the men in that camp was to be the eyes for this new, integrated form of warfare. They were there to orchestrate a storm. The uncomfortable truth landed in the center of the bunker with the force of an artillery strike. The entire Japanese defensive strategy for Saipan was predicated on their mastery of the island's terrain. Their strength lay in their hardened, hidden positions, their fortified caves, and their expertly concealed artillery batteries dug deep into the reverse slopes of the mountains, safe from the flat trajectory fire of the American fleet. They had intended to let the Americans establish a beachhead and then, once the invaders were trapped between the sea and the mountains, annihilate them with a perfectly orchestrated deluge of pre-sighted artillery fire. It was a good plan, a classic, by-the-book defensive plan. Kinoshita's discovery revealed that the Americans weren't just refusing to play by the book, they had set the book on fire. With this new combination of electronic warfare and proximity-fused shells, the Japanese defensive positions were no longer safe. The mountains no longer offered protection. An air-bursting shell would rain death down from above, killing men in the very trenches and caves they believed were their salvation. Every position the Japanese high command believed was secure was, in fact, naked and vulnerable. The Americans weren't planning to fight their way through the Japanese defenses. They were planning to obliterate them from afar. This truth was profoundly, strategically, and politically inconvenient. It meant that General Sato's entire defensive posture was built on a catastrophic flaw. To accept Kinoshida's theory was to accept that they were already beaten. It was more than an intelligence report, it was a heresy. The liaison officer from General Sato's headquarters, a prim, arrogant major named Kanda, was the first to speak. His voice was filled with a cold, dismissive fury. "This is speculative nonsense," he sneered, looking at Kinoshita as if he were an insect. The ramblings of a junior officer panicked by radio static. Colonel Agawa, his face grim, stepped forward. "Major, this is more than static. Sergeant Major Ishii is one of our finest soldiers. He took 30 of our best men into that valley. He was not out-scouted or out-fought in a fair contest. He was dismantled. His report speaks of a perfectly engineered trap. It confirms the enemy's sophistication. We cannot ignore this." Major Kanda turned his venom on Agawa. "Sergeant Major Ishii was outsmarted, Colonel. It is a disgrace, not a data point. To suggest that we should alter our entire strategy based on this ghost story, is defeatism. Do you hear me, Colonel? Defeatism. General Saito is already formulating a plan for a coordinated banzai charge to overwhelm the American beachhead. We will solve this problem with spirit and steel, not with fanciful theories about invisible weapons. Your focus is to be on the front line." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Do not let the phantom fears of a technician compromise your honor." He turned his glare back to Kinoshita. "Lieutenant, you will cease this unauthorized investigation immediately. Your duty is to monitor enemy troop communications. Is that understood?" The threat was unspoken, but crystal clear. To push this theory further would be an act of insubordination, a stain on one's honor. The system was pushing back, choosing the comforting, honorable lie of a conventional battle over the terrifying, paradigm-shifting truth of a technological slaughter. Kinoshita had discovered the key to the entire American strategy, but the lock was the rigid, impenetrable mind of his own high command. They had the truth, but they were forbidden to speak it, let alone act on it. The order from General Sato's headquarters was a steel door slammed shut. The official reality, dictated from the top, had won. The Phantom in the Jungle was officially downgraded to a deep reconnaissance unit. Lieutenant Kinoshita's meticulously assembled theory about a revolutionary form of electronic and precision warfare was dismissed, filed away, and effectively buried under the immense weight of institutional pride. The major from headquarters had made it brutally clear the accepted narrative was that the battle for Saipan would be won by Japanese fighting spirit, by the bayonet, by the noble sacrifice of the banzai charge. To suggest otherwise was defeatism. Colonel Agawa, a man trapped between a terrifying truth and an immovable chain of command, was ordered to redeploy his focus to the coastal defenses. His private concerns were irrelevant. His duty was to obey, and Lieutenant Kinoshita was formally reassigned. He was taken off signals intelligence analysis, the vital work of divining enemy strategy, and put on traffic monitoring. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of being sent to a Siberian salt mine. His new job was to sit in his bunker, headphones on, and simply log the call signs of American units on the front line. It was tedious, mind-numbing work, a job for a trainee, not for the one man on the island who had actually deciphered the enemy's master plan. He was silenced, grounded. The system had protected itself from the uncomfortable truth he had uncovered. The sense of dread in Agawa's regimental command post was suffocating. He and Kinoshita knew what was coming. They were like weathermen who had proven beyond any doubt that a Category 5 hurricane was about to make landfall, only to be ordered by the governor to issue a forecast for sunny skies. They were forced to stand by and watch as the island prepared for the wrong kind of war, a war that existed only on their commanders' maps and in their outdated manuals. The preparations for the great banzai charge began. It was to be the ultimate expression of the Bushido Code, a final, decisive gamble. Thousands of soldiers, many of them already starving and low on ammunition, were pulled from their defensive positions. They were being massed for a single, colossal human wave attack aimed at punching through the American lines and driving the invaders back into the sea. It was a strategy born of desperation and faith, a belief that sheer willpower could overcome overwhelming firepower. It was also, as Kinoshita and Agawa knew with sickening certainty, a march into a perfectly prepared killing field. The target for the charge was a sector of the American lines held by the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division. The Japanese planners saw it as the weakest point in the American front. Kinoshita, however, saw something different in his monotonous radio logs. He saw a massive, disproportionate buildup of American artillery and naval assets assigned to support that weak sector. The traffic was constant, a quiet hum of logistical coordination that spoke of immense power being gathered just over the horizon. The Americans weren't just holding the line there, they were fortifying it, turning it into an anvil upon which a great hammer was about to fall. But his reports, which noted this anomalous buildup, were ignored. They didn't fit the approved narrative. The system was now blind, deaf, and moving inexorably towards the cliff's edge. The lowest point came on the evening of July 6, 1944. The final orders for the charge were disseminated. Kinoshita sat in his bunker, the headphones feeling like a vice on his skull, listening to the banal chatter of the American units opposite the staging area for the Banzai attack. He heard a Marine fire team calling for more K rations. He heard a tank crew complaining about the heat. And then, cutting through the noise, he heard it. The Phantom Captain's signal. It was back on the air, broadcasting on the same frequency, from the same impossible location. But this time, the voice was different. It wasn't issuing routine orders. It was a short, coded transmission, repeated twice. Kinoshita didn't have the key to the high-level cipher, but he didn't need one. He knew, with the chilling certainty of a condemned man hearing the executioner's footsteps, exactly what that signal meant. The eyes were in position. The jamming was active. The weapon was ready. He ripped off his headphones and ran, stumbling through the dark communication trenches to Colonel Egawa's bunker. He burst in, foregoing all protocol. "Sir, the signal. It's active again. They know. They are waiting for us." Colonel Egawa looked up from his desk, his face a mask of exhausted resignation. He held up a piece of paper. It was a direct order from General Saito himself, stamped in red. "The attack commences at 0400 hours, Egawa said, his voice hollow. "All units will advance. There will be no retreat. Long live the Emperor." The disaster they had tried to prevent was no longer a theory on a map or a whisper in the static. It was an order, signed and sealed. The hurricane was just a few hours from shore, and the entire island was being marched down to the beach for a parade. The price of truth is often paid in blood, and on the night of July 6th, the bill for the Japanese High Command's willful ignorance came due. The Great Banzai Charge, the final, desperate gamble for Saipan, was not a battle. It was an industrial-scale extermination, carried out with the cold, impersonal efficiency of a machine. It was the horrifying, physical manifestation of everything Lieutenant Kinoshita had tried to warn them about. From a forward observation post, a young American Marine lieutenant, his radio handset pressed to his ear, watched the spectacle unfold in the greenish, ghostly light of star shells. He saw what looked like the entire Japanese army rising from the earth. A tide of men, 3,000 or 4,000 strong, surging forward. There were soldiers in full uniform, armed with rifles and bayonets. There were walking wounded, armed with bamboo spears. There were even men armed with nothing but rocks, their mouths open in a silent, collective scream that was swallowed by the immense, pre-dawn darkness. Their officers led from the front, swords held high, glinting in the pale, descending light. It should have been terrifying. It should have been the climactic, terrifying charge that broke the American lines. But for the American lieutenant, it was something else entirely. It was a target. A big, beautiful, perfect target. He spoke a few calm words into his radio, his voice betraying no emotion. "Target package 1. On my command. Fire for effect." And then the sky fell in. The first volley wasn't from the rifles of the infantrymen in their foxholes. It came from the sea and from the hills behind him. Miles away, the big guns of the U.S. Navy and the massed Army artillery, which had been silent for hours, erupted in a single, coordinated roar. Hundreds of guns firing as one. But these were not the dumb, indiscriminate shells of a typical bombardment. These were shells fused with the new VT technology, raining down in perfectly timed airbursts. Instead of plastering the landscape with craters, they descended with terrifying precision, detonating 50 feet above the ground. They didn't just hit the front of the Japanese charge, they vaporized the command and control posts in the rear. They annihilated the reserve forces before they could even enter the fight. The charging waves of men ran headlong into an invisible, downward-slashing wall of high explosives and shrapnel that no trench or foxhole could protect them from. This was the Phantom Captain's masterpiece. The jamming operation had blinded the Japanese artillery, preventing them from providing any counter-battery fire. The intelligence from the Radio Shack had allowed the Americans to anticipate the exact time and place of the attack. And the new VT fuses, directed by forward observers operating on perfectly clear radio channels, allowed them to surgically dismember the Japanese assault. From his bunker, forced to be a helpless bystander, Lieutenant Kinoshita could only listen to the unfolding catastrophe. The Japanese battle nets, which should have been alive with reports and orders, were a cacophony of screams, static, and then, one by one, a creeping, spreading silence as command posts were obliterated. He could picture it perfectly. The plan he had warned them about was being executed flawlessly. The charging soldiers were not a glorious wave of invincible spirit. They were iron filings being drawn inexorably into a magnetic field of death. The Banzai Charge, the pride of the Imperial Army and the symbol of its indomitable spirit, broke against the American lines and was shattered. It lasted for 15 horrific hours. When the guns finally fell silent, the fields before the 27th Division were carpeted with the dead. Over 4,000 Japanese soldiers were killed in that single, futile attack. It was the largest Banzai Charge of the entire Pacific War, and it was also the last. It didn't just fail to break the American lines, it broke the back of the Japanese defense of Saipan. The battle was over. The Phantom Captain had won, and the cost of ignoring the truth was written in a language of blood and bodies that stretched for miles. This story, like so many secrets of the Second World War, should have ended there, buried in the coral rock of Saipan, its truth known only to a handful of men on both sides. The official American after-action reports were concise and clinical. The mass Banzai Charge was repelled by the tenacious defense of the 27th Infantry Division and devastatingly effective coordinated artillery support. There was no mention of a Phantom Captain, no reference to a secret jungle encampment, no hint of a revolutionary electronic warfare campaign. The system, in its own way, had buried the truth just as effectively as the Japanese high command had. The novel technologies were classified top secret, and the men who wielded them were ghosts, their contributions filed away in locked vaults. For decades, the story remained a simple, brutal tale of overwhelming American firepower. But the truth of war has a way of lingering. It waits patiently in the silence of archives, in the faded ink of forgotten logbooks, in the memories of old men who have carried their burdens for a lifetime. Our investigation now jumps forward in time, not just a few years, but nearly half a century. The year is 1992. The location is a quiet university archive in Quantico, Virginia, the home of the United States Marine Corps. A young, determined historian is digging through a newly declassified collection of documents. The collection is blandly titled World War II CNO, OP 20, GI Miscellaneous Communications Intelligence Reports, Pacific Theater. It's a mountain of paper, thousands of pages of dry, technical data that most researchers would ignore. But this historian is a different breed. He's not looking for the big picture, he's looking for the cracks in it. And in a dusty box, misfiled under signal propagation anomalies, he finds it. It's a slim file, no more than 20 pages, bound in a simple cardboard cover. The official project code name was a sterile Operation Hearts and Minds, but in a handwritten note on the cover, someone had scrawled the unofficial, far more fitting name Operation Captain Ahab. As the historian reads, the quiet archive around him melts away, replaced by the humid, green twilight of a Saipan jungle. The file is the final, missing piece of the puzzle. It's the playbook for the entire deception. It details the creation of a brand new, highly experimental unit. Their official designation was the 1st Joint Communications Platoon, a deliberately boring name for a group of men who were anything but. They were a hand-picked team of radio engineers from Bell Labs, Marine Corps Navajo code talkers, Nisei linguists from the Military Intelligence Service who could perfectly mimic Japanese command cadence, and a grizzled Navy captain, pulled from a desk job in Pearl Harbor, who had a background in amateur theater. The file lays it all out. The captain was an actor, The Naval Command chatter was a script. The relaxed, vulnerable-looking camp was a stage set. The technicians were, in fact, a security detail of Marine Raiders, the most elite jungle fighters the U.S. had. The loudspeaker that mocked Sergeant Major Ishii was a psychological warfare tool specifically designed to induce doctrinal paralysis. The jamming, the VD fuses, it was all there. The unit's mission was threefold. First, create a high-value ghost target to lure elite Japanese forces into a trap. Second, use electronic warfare to blind and deafen the enemy's own artillery observation while protecting their own. Third, act as the eyes for the devastating new combination of centrally controlled massed artillery and VT proximity fuses. It was a brand new form of warfare, a seamless integration of signals intelligence, psychological operations, and advanced technology. They weren't just a combat unit, they were, in a very real sense, a team of battlefield magicians. The final page of the file is a post-operation assessment written by the Navy captain himself. It's concise, almost poetic in its military brevity. He concludes that the operation was a success, but he adds a chilling, handwritten note at the bottom. Enemy command consistently demonstrated a rigid adherence to established doctrine, making them highly susceptible to psychological misdirection. Their greatest weakness was not a lack of courage, but a lack of imagination. In that quiet university archive, the fog of war that had shrouded Saipan for 50 years finally, completely, lifted. The phantom captain wasn't a ghost. He was an idea. The declassified file was his confession. The story was no longer just about firepower. It was about something far more subtle and far more devastating. A lack of imagination. In the brutal calculus of war, the most advanced weapon is not always made of steel. Sometimes, it is simply an idea. An idea that your enemy cannot conceive of until it is far, far too late.